Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Intersectionality, Disability, and Employment in Canada, a panel presentation. My name is Shapeo Gurinde. I'm the director of the Innovation Lab at CASE, and I have the honor of being your moderator today. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. I do this to reaffirm my commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to increasing my own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, I acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. The acknowledgement of this land is a declaration of our collective responsibility to this place and its people's histories, rights, and presence, and to the ongoing work of reconciliation. This event is hosted by the CASE Innovation Lab. CASE, the Canadian Association for Supported Employment, is a national network of service providers, employers, and community allies committed to increasing employment inclusion for people living in Canada who experience disability. We believe that opportunities to collaborate, innovate, and learn alongside each other are important in this endeavor. I invite you to visit the CASE website or to reach out to any of the CASE staff to learn more about our programs, initiatives, and offerings. A few housekeeping items. I'd like to take a moment to highlight our accessibility features for today. Today's webinar is accompanied by subtitles and ASL or LSQ interpretation. The Innovation Lab's position paper project explores the critical intersections of disability, employment, and broader social identities in Canada, highlighting systemic barriers and opportunities for inclusive change. Developed by leading experts and lived experience advocates, these papers examine how factors like race, gender, indigeneity, and social economic status shape employment experiences for persons experiencing disability. Through evidence-based insights and actionable recommendations, the project aims to inform policy, workplace practices, and advocacy efforts, driving forward a more equitable and inclusive labor market. The CASE Innovation Lab sponsored 4 organizations to develop position papers. A position paper was developed on intersectionality, disability, and women and gender diverse persons by Dawn Canada, titled Do the Right Thing: Deaf and Disabled Women and the World of Work. The findings from this paper will be presented today by Nashwa, Lina Khan. A paper focused on intersectionality, disability, and youth titled Promoting Employment Participation for Youth with Disabilities was prepared by the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, or CCRW, and will be presented by Renaud. The third paper on intersectionality, disability, and Indigenous persons, titled Intersectionality, Indigenous Experiences, and Disability and Employment Support, was developed by Community Futures Treaty 7 and will be presented today by McEwen. I would like to introduce our first presenter, Nashwa Lina Khan from Dawn Canada. Dawn Canada, which stands for Disabled Women's Network Canada, is an intersectional feminist human rights organization founded in 1985. Their mission is to end poverty, isolation, discrimination, and violence experienced by women and gender diverse people with disabilities, including those who are deaf. Dawn Canada works to address systemic oppression through research, policy advocacy, and community collaboration. Nashwa Lina Khan is a senior research associate at Dawn Canada and a PhD student in the Faculty of Environment and Urban Change at York University. With over a decade of qualitative and quantitative research experience in community and public health, Nashwa's work focuses on sexual and reproductive health, gender-based violence, and the intersections of disability, race, and gender. At Dawn Canada, Nashwa leads key initiatives rooted in disability justice and gender equity. She has worked on the Cookum Project, which addresses elder abuse against older Indigenous women with disabilities, and the Reimagining Disabled Futures podcast, a platform amplifying the voices and experiences of disabled women and gender diverse people. Beyond her research and advocacy, Nashwa is actively involved in the arts and community organizing. She also shares her cultural commentary on the podcast Habibi Please and collaborates with Proclaiming Our Roots, the University of Alberta, and Rainbow Faith and Freedom to mobilize knowledge and foster intersectional conversations. Do the Right Thing, Deaf and Disabled Women and the World of Work is an initiative by Dawn Canada focused on addressing the unique challenges faced by deaf and disabled gender diverse people and women in the workforce. So we welcome you right now, Nashwa, to make your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction, Sope. So today I will be speaking on behalf of Dawn Canada about the Do the Right Thing position paper, and it's about deaf and disabled women in the world of work. The overview for today is I want to do an introduction, our approach, what the Do the Right Thing project has been, and what the case position paper has allowed us to do and examine. Some key objectives, gender-specific barriers, previous learnings that have inspired us to try to do this phase, and what we've learned so far, the revamp and the future direction. I want to do a brief land acknowledgement for Dawn's two offices. So our offices are on Mohawk Nation and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, but what we emphasize at Dawn is that there's no real move towards truth and reconciliation without knowing the land you're on, but also actual material giving of land back. So Dawn Canada, we have two offices, one in Montreal and one in Ottawa. We're a federal organization, and we are the oldest disability justice organization that is focused on women and gender diverse people more recently in Canada and in the world, actually. And our mission is to end, as Sope said, the poverty, isolation, discrimination, and violence experienced by women and gender diverse people in Canada. And we're celebrating our 40th year this year. As was mentioned earlier, I'm the senior researcher at Dawn, and a bit about the projects that we currently have on the go. One of them is the Do the Right Thing project. We have a few projects on gender-based violence that are part of our 10-year plan to combat gender-based violence. We have one that started with phase rooting resilience. We're now in root change, and then the next phase will be root justice in the next 3 years. And a bit more about this paper is that it's being co-written by my colleague Lensa Hessen, so I can't take full credit for it at all. And I've more so conceptualized, but Lensa's been taking on the bulk of that, so I want to name that. Our approach, which also undergirds our research and position papers like this, is that we look at research, education, policy, and advocacy, which is super important when we're talking about Do the Right Thing, because it's a paper that we're using now to revamp older work that has a research lens. But then we use knowledge mobilization through education and workshops. We had a workshop actually last year in Newfoundland about the paper and about why we need human rights in the workplace, especially at that intersection of disability and gender. And then we work on policy and advocacy. So that includes doing parliamentary briefs, deputations, and other policy work when we do advocacy with different levels of government. And this position paper, which I'll talk about now a bit, actually highlights Dawn's four-pillar approach in the best way. So Do the Right Thing was established many moons ago with a preliminary paper in 2019. And we approached CASE because we are revamping this curriculum that goes alongside it, but we needed new evidence and a new paper, especially post-COVID-19, for how things have changed in the world of work. And so it's a project that's focused on developing and implementing systemic level responses to addressing barriers. There was a whole campaign around it. COVID-19 happened, and we know that a lot has changed, especially for people who are disabled in different ways. And so with this revamp, we're hoping to actually be able to do this research, have this foundational new knowledge that's up to date, and be able to circulate practical tools, educational material for employers, service providers, and also people to be self-advocates. And this would be done through a guided curriculum, which can be customized within the labor market if an employer needs it customized or tailored. What I do also want to say is that Do the Right Thing is a project focused on addressing barriers, but also how do you go past barriers? It's very easy to name barriers. How do we get to a place where people don't have to ask for accommodations? And so, for example, this image, although I've put it on just an image description, it's a balance with somebody who's standing and able-bodied and then somebody who's in a wheelchair. And that's like a typical image that's used in workplaces when they want to talk about employment rights or accessibility. But we know that physical barriers are not the only ones, and that intersecting identities actually add to whatever barriers that people think are universal barriers when they think about disability and access to work. And we'll get a bit more into that later on in the presentation. And so the project takes this intersectional approach, acknowledging that systemic discrimination based on disability, gender, race, and other factors compound employment challenges. And other factors can be socioeconomic status, they can be immigration status, they can be the type of disability. There's certain disabilities that are quote unquote easier for employers to accommodate by like adding a ramp, adding a bar, versus other disabilities like a brain injury, which employers often don't know how to accommodate because it's just not something that has been prioritized or something that has a one size fits all fix. And so this paper and the work that Dawn does around this work is aim to create inclusive work environments by partnering with employers, policymakers, and community organizations. And it also empowers participants with tools of self-advocacy and workplace rights in later phases. So knowing what your rights are, knowing who you can go to, knowing different resources. So the overview for the paper and the way the paper has been outlined is identifying and addressing barriers. And we've seen that as systemic, cultural, personal, and other obstacles to employment, which will be expanded on in the paper in more detail. But a systemic barrier or cultural one can be a cultural attitude of ableism that exists throughout Canada, throughout the world. And so, specific to case, we're thinking about how do we identify these barriers in a way that employers can just know if they have them and how to combat them. Promoting inclusive employment practices. So, that includes advocating for policy change and workplace accommodations. Currently, provinces govern themselves differently for workplace accommodations. There are certain rights you're supposed to have, but it's very complicated and bureaucratic. So, it's how to make employment more inclusive and easier. Do people have to come to you with accommodations? It shouldn't be that way. It should feel also safe and comfortable asking for any kind of accommodation. Do you need medical documentation? How extensive? How expensive? How long is that documentation needed? And at what point does that become ableist in nature, actually? Highlighting best practices. So sharing successful case studies and partnerships. So through this research, we've been able to see some spaces that actually have found ways to work with people, gender diverse folks and women who are disabled, and find different ways to accommodate them. We see that with how CCRW works. We see that in our own practice at Dawn, where we talk often about and share how we have more disabled people than the average Canadian workspace, because that is our mission. It is what we do, but also we've had to find a lot of ways to accommodate that other employment may not do. Empowering self-advocacy, so supporting disabled and women and gender diverse people and navigating their workplace rights. There's a lot of rights that are not accessed, or people are scared or overwhelmed or intimidated to access these rights, and it's because of fear of retribution. So having a stronger knowledge base, having employers know that they actually can be held liable, having people know where they can go for legal advocacy or actual like legislation on what they're actually entitled to is a big piece of this as well. So some of the key objectives, just going a bit more into what I meant there with the 4 pillars we're working on with the paper, is that we're identifying and addressing barriers. So when we say systemic, there's discriminatory hiring practices, which become hard to prove, but there's been some groundbreaking cases on that. Inaccessible workspaces, so that's the built environment. It can also be the mental environment of a workspace. the cultural negative societal attitudes and stereotypes. So people believing people who are disabled cannot accomplish and achieve certain things. Personal, so that's internalized stigma, lack of self-confidence. So internalized stigma is that people who have systemically their whole lives been told they can't work in a certain space or can't do certain jobs. That's like a cultural attitude that gets ingrained because of that stigma. And so being able to identify and address that and tell people, actually, like, wait, you're not wrong, or you're not actually the problem, or you're not the one with issues. It's actually the way the world is built around us that's an ableist environment. Advocating for inclusive employment, so policy changes for equitable hiring and retention. So it's one thing to hire, but the big thing we're seeing with the research, we see when we get phone calls and when we do focus groups, is that people can be hired as an equity hire, especially like with new DEI policies. But disabled folks, especially disabled women and gender diverse people, are not retained. Bosses, employers do not want to work with them, do not want to try to find a way to work through an issue, quote unquote. They don't want to find a way to find an accommodation or an understanding. And so there are ways. There's partners like CCRW, who also is very close to case. And I will talk a little bit about where they have ways to help employers retain employees who have disability, but also to help disabled folks to stay employed, but also to get those accommodations that they need, whether that's like a desk that is standing and then can lower, or that's about a certain type of chair, or that's about a certain type of support for rehabilitation, like occupational therapy to get through a day. And so that's also part of that is collaboration with employers and policymakers. And the self-advocacy piece, I mentioned CCRW. So CCRW is a nonprofit that promotes and supports meaningful and equitable employment. So they are one of the ones we go to in Canada to look at their work and their track record of how to develop workplace rights and resources and to creating peer support networks. So creating peer support networks is something Dawn does. It's also one of our main things is peer support, and our tagline is peer support saves lives for our Root Change project. And we do that with work as well because we think that peer support, whether it's peer support around reproductive health and justice, peer support around work, you can share with other people who are disabled about how they were able to get accommodations, how they feel at work. Having that shared experience across identity has been shown and proven in so many research spaces, but also just we know this from lived experience to motivate people to strengthen community, but to also give them more meaning and feel like they actually belong in a workspace. And it just gets to continue and have continuity and not feel isolated and alone. Looking at gender specific barriers. So we name a few in the paper. One of them is transportation. And this is also from anecdotal evidence that Dawn has had for years, but there is also academic evidence that women with disabilities face greater risks of GBV while commuting. We know that, for example, women who are seeing impaired cannot take transportation for work all the time because they will face gender based violence on transit in ways that others do not. And childcare, there's a lack of affordable and accessible options, and that hinders job retention. And when you're disabled, you might need longer windows of childcare because getting to the childcare might take longer. There's different needs that you have. So this is something that we've largely learned, but also it's not kind of pushed or thought of when people are thinking about this intersection of disability and gender and how does that impact people, because people are not going to Uber to work every day. That becomes very expensive, or take a taxi to work. It's not also reliable, and also they can also face gender-based violence if transportation is not reliable, or you feel like sexism could occur in an interaction or misogyny or something. You're not going to have as easy a time going to work. There's also other gender specific barriers where if sexism already exists, being disabled and ableism already exists, being at that access, you're going to have this double compounded experience of being doubted in a workspace. So that's one of the things we're finding with the paper. In 2019, we had these quotes from participants that I just wanted to highlight because it's carried the work and inspired us in this round to keep doing this work and to actually revamp it. And Case has given us the opportunity to actually take the time to sit with the work and actually give this 2025 lens on it. So in 2019, there were focus groups for Do the Rights Thing where participants said a number of things, but some of the pieces were very essential and basic, which is listen when people with disabilities speak and when they shared the different barriers they've encountered over their time working. Remember that we can do almost anything just in a different way. So accommodations, like I said earlier, don't always look like a ramp or a bar. They have to look like other pieces because disability has such a range and one size fits all doesn't actually make sense. If you want to have a retained workforce of women and gender diverse people who are disabled, inclusivity in the workplace is important to me. It should be a safe space for everyone, no matter what disabilities they have. So if somebody has an episodic disability, this is a big one we see where workplace retention is very difficult. People need to understand, employers need to understand, managers need to understand, directors, coordinators, what episodic actually means and different ways you can accommodate it. Does an email actually need to be sent that day? Does that actually hinder the workplace working in a certain way? Is there a way to assign projects and wait for projects to be delivered instead of needing things at every single step at a certain date if the project is still delivered within a certain time frame that's reasonable? There's different ways. If somebody has an episodic disability and they want to work in evenings and weekends, is there a way to accommodate that? There's a lot of just simple kind of solutions that can work, especially in this world of post-COVID where people have long COVID, but also we've learned that people can telework, people can have hybrid work. Why can that happen when the whole world is impacted, but not when just disabled folks advocate for that? I am more resilient and resourceful than I ever thought I would be. So disabled folks are resilient. We've been saying it, but it's just giving the environment and the tools. And so all you need to do is listen. So there's just different ways of listening that human resources departments can also work with people and get creative, which is a big part of what we think about at Dawn as an intersectional feminist organization. There were key themes identified. So the value of disability expertise, which is guiding this paper as well, continuous engagement, not one-time fixes, not one-size-fits solutions, flexibility and creativity in accommodations, which I've mentioned, thinking outside the box. We don't need to be rigid sometimes in workplaces. Employers and managers don't need to be. You don't need a sick note for 3 days. For example, if you know somebody has an episodic disability, that's a barrier. They're not going to ask for that time off work because sick note costs money. Going to the doctor can be laborious. It can trigger things. So that's just one example of just being flexible, which some of the provinces actually don't even need sick notes anymore, but some of them still do or employers do. Legislation as a safety net, not a rule book. So not acting like it's a burden to have a disabled person in your workplace. Equity laws are important, but self-advocacy and creativity and believing people instead of doing it as this compliance, like begrudgingly. Centering disabled women and gender diverse people at work. Having like a workplace committee is one example on disability accommodations, incorporating that at a lot of workplaces. And then acknowledging underrepresented voices. Disability advocacy has a history of the type of disabled person that tends to be catered to. So that includes even things like what weight elevators are made for, like the different things like elevator adaptations or stair adaptations. Who's that made for? Whose body? But also the typical life of who's accommodated with a disability. It's usually research shows somebody who's white in a wheelchair. That's where people's brains go when they create legislation. And we just know that's not what the world looks like. And that's not what the world that Dawn operates and advocates looks like. So acknowledging that women of color, Indigenous women, women with intellectual disabilities, blind and low vision are underrepresented. Deaf women are deeply underrepresented because people do not want to hire that kind of accommodation. It costs a lot of money. There's a lot of things thrown around, but we also know that to strengthen inclusive recruitment strategies and develop workplaces that actually represent what Canada looks like, we need to actually stop making those barriers and make sure and think about who's not at a table. So our future direction, because Case and others have offered some support through being able to write this paper, a lot has changed. We're integrating new research and lived experiences. Lensa is doing that work. Lensa Hassan is doing that work. We're expanding the curriculum to reach more regions and strengthening partnerships. So hoping to do more presentations in the future, like we did in Newfoundland, and also look specifically at workplaces who need help. We know that despite these commitments to equity, Canadian labor market continues to reflect ableist employment practices, and research shows that people with disabilities face higher unemployment at rates 3% higher than non-disabled counterparts, and they earn on average $1.91 less per hour. So part of making an equitable place is hiring more, sure. The federal government has also done that commitment, but also making sure that the pay is actually the same. That's part of the root change. Why would you feel included in a work environment if you know you're paid less because of a disability? And when gender is factored in, we know it's even worse because of the gender pay gap parity. So that's one piece that is an easy fix for employers and could be an unconscious bias, but it could be a bias, obviously, and that creates a cycle of ableism in a workspace. So, our call to action with this paper is join us in advocating for inclusive employment, engaging with the Do the Right Thing project so you can collaborate, share, support growth and knowledge sharing in general. So, if you'd like to get in touch with us about the project or anything else, we also have one of the versions of the paper on the website. That's an older version, and we look forward to putting this one out with Case in French and English. But you can contact info@dawncanada.net. But yes, thank you for joining us today, and I hope that I shed some light on why we need more inclusive practices for women and gender diverse people.
Thanks, Nashwa. I would now like to welcome Lauren Renaud from CCRW. The Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, or CCRW, is a not-for-profit organization that promotes and supports meaningful and equitable employment of persons with disabilities. CCRW provides one-on-one employment goal planning and coaching, resume and cover letter support, interview skills practices, supportive job search, accommodation and disability disclosure support, and more. Lauren Renaud is a researcher at CCRW. Lauren received her master's in health promotion at Dalhousie University, completing a thesis on physical and social barriers in post-secondary institutions for students with mobility-related disabilities. Lauren has been contributing to accessibility and employment research at CCRW for the past year. Youth with disabilities continue to be underemployed compared to youth without disabilities. Given the increasing number of youth with disabilities in Canada, we must address these barriers to employment. During the next presentation, we will review historical and current barriers to employment, current trends in employment for youth with disabilities, and strategies for supporting youth with disabilities to secure meaningful employment. Lauren will be presenting CCRW's position paper on intersectionality, disability, and youth titled Promoting Employment Participation for Youth with Disabilities. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you very much, Sope. I'm very happy to be here today. So yeah, just like you said, my name is Lauren, and I'm a researcher at CCRW. And I'll be speaking to you today on behalf of my colleagues on the research team at CCRW. So what I'll be sharing today are key findings from our review of scholarly and community research, CCRW's research projects, and data and testimonials from CCRW's employment services. So I'd just like to begin by talking a bit about why we chose to focus on youth with disabilities. And the reason for this is that disability advocates have been fighting for a long time for the rights of persons with disabilities to participate meaningfully and equitably in the labor market. However, their efforts have kind of historically been focused on the disability community generally, and it's only recently that there's been special attention paid to youth with disabilities and their participation in the workforce. This might be because it's really only recently that Canada has measured participation in the workforce for youth with disabilities. And when I'm talking about youth, we're looking at those age 15 to 24, just because that's kind of the definition that the Government of Canada and Statistics Canada uses, although there are other definitions in the literature. So looking at the statistics in Canada, there are two key things that we're seeing. The first is that the number of youth with disabilities in Canada is growing. In fact, between 2017 and 2022, youth saw the largest increase in disability of any other age group. The second thing we're seeing is that there is a gap in employment rates between youth with disabilities and youth without. So youth with disabilities are less likely to be employed. Now, why is this a concern? Looking at people who are in that kind of 15 to 24 age range, they're in a really important transitional period in their life. So early employment experiences during this time really set the stage for their future in the workforce. So it's really important that we start addressing the barriers that they experience. So what are some of these barriers? So historically, persons with disabilities, including youth, have been kept out of the mainstream workforce. So instead, they're placed in institutions or sheltered workshops, which are generally exploitative. And it was again through the efforts of disability advocates that persons with disabilities became a designated group in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, protecting them from discrimination as they enter the workforce. Since that time, there have been additional advancements. So there's more inclusive legislation that's emerged, including the Accessible Canada Act, which outlines a national goal that Canada should be barrier-free by 2040. So with these advancements, why are we still seeing youth with disabilities employed at lower rates than youth without disabilities? And so there are many barriers that are facing youth with disabilities today across different levels of our society. So on the slide here, you'll be able to see I've illustrated some of the different barriers at the societal, community, institutional, interpersonal, and individual levels. So let's begin at the societal level. A key barrier for youth with disabilities in Canada is poverty. So compared to other wealthy developed nations, Canada spends very little of its GDP on financial supports for persons with disabilities. So in fact, among these countries, only South Korea, Turkey, and Mexico spend less than we do. Youth with disabilities in Canada are more likely than any age group, including seniors with disabilities, to live in poverty. In fact, they're twice as likely to live in poverty than seniors with disabilities. So this, as you can probably imagine, is a huge barrier to employment for youth with disabilities because they may be less likely to have access to things that are not publicly funded in Canada. So things like post-secondary education, employment training, and services that they might need to manage their disability. So things like medication, physiotherapy, and other allied health services. Ableist attitudes also persist in society today. So youth with disabilities exist at the intersection of age and disability and can experience really unique barriers at this intersection. For instance, they might be seen as less competent, less independent, they might not be taken seriously, and people might think they're quote unquote too young to have a disability. So next, let's talk about community barriers. So public high schools in the community often provide options for employment preparation. So things like co-ops, career counseling, career curricula. But what we found in our search is that not only does the availability of these services vary school to school in Canada, they might not be relevant or accessible for youth with disabilities. For instance, career counselors might not really know how to support youth with disabilities in their career planning. It might also be more difficult to find accessible placements, like co-op placements and things like that for these youth. Again, in the community, job services can be inaccessible for youth with disabilities. These organizations might be physically inaccessible, and they might not be culturally appropriate or easy to navigate for newcomers to Canada, including youth. And then public transportation is another community barrier for youth with disabilities in accessing, volunteer opportunities, work opportunities, things like that. Some youth with disabilities might be unable to drive for a variety of reasons, but including due to their disability. And so they might rely on public transportation. And some issues with public transportation are they can be just unavailable, communities that simply don't have public transportation. They can be inaccessible. And youth can also be denied service, harassed, or treated like an inconvenience due to their disability. So that's just a few community barriers. There are also barriers at the institutional level. So one example is post-secondary institutions. We know, ableist attitudes, norms, and stigma do persist in these settings. And like we talked about in high school settings, post-secondary career services often fail to meet the needs of students with disabilities. And so these barriers can trickle down into the workplace. So for example, job application processes might be inaccessible, workplaces might lack the supports for youth with disabilities, and work can be precarious for youth with disabilities. So part-time or contract work is very common, and it may not provide the same supports or opportunities as government disability benefits, so things like healthcare coverage, for example. So it might actually be a difficult decision to enter the workforce for youth with disabilities, as they might be at risk of losing these benefits. So there are also now many interpersonal barriers that I'd like to talk about. So parents and guardians can have low expectations of their children with disabilities to participate in the workforce. They might also be overprotective, worrying about the safety of their children in the workplace. And they might be over-involved in the job search for their children, which can really reduce, youth's autonomy, confidence, and opportunity to gain skills and experience. And of course, I have to talk about employer stigma and misperceptions about disability because this is also a very big barrier for youth. Employers might be reluctant to hire youth with disabilities, and they might kind of believe some myths that have been debunked, but still kind of prevail. So they might worry that accommodations will be too costly, that these workers will be less productive, or that they might be opening themselves up to legal action if they're considering applicants with disabilities. And youth with disabilities are also likely to have smaller personal and professional networks, and that can limit their ability to learn about things like volunteer or work opportunities, or just to receive, advice or guidance. So finally, I'll just conclude here with the barriers at the individual level. So internalized ableism can be a barrier, kind of leading to, low self-confidence, low self-perception, which in turn can lead to less confidence disclosing their needs or asking for accommodations from employers. They might fear the judgment of others because of their previous experiences. And it might also be especially true for young men who might find it difficult to ask for help because of gendered expectations. It's also common for youth with certain disabilities to spend much of their adolescence seeking medical care or being involved in the health system in some way. And that can delay, school completion and limit or delay their opportunity to take part in things like volunteering or those early work experiences. So now, because of kind of all of those pieces, youth might have had fewer opportunities to take part in those early work experiences. And so as a result, they might lack some of the skills that they might need to look for, obtain, and retain work. So with all that said, what can we actually do about this? And luckily, there are some best practices that can be leveraged to support youth with disabilities. So mentorship is a particularly promising strategy shown to help youth with disabilities build their confidence, make better career planning decisions, and build skills. So establishing those mentorship programs with dedicated mentors and mentees sufficient resources, and continual improvement mechanisms can improve experiences for youth. Opportunities to build employment and life skills are also valuable. So things like soft skills training, because we know soft skills are valued in the workplace. Self-advocacy skills are also important so that youth with disabilities can feel confident asking for accommodations and dealing with those challenging situations at work. And finally, on the job support, so things like job coaches who can kind of provide that ongoing support for both employee and employer can help create a more inclusive workplace. And employers can also make changes to the workplace, schedule, and tasks to support workers with disabilities, or in other words, to provide accommodations in the workplace. They can also develop policies to establish consistent methods of responding to accommodation requests to reduce bias and also to help foster an inclusive environment. And it's very important that employers create that inclusive environment so workers feel comfortable disclosing their needs. So that's a very high-level overview of our paper, which we hope that you'll take a look at to learn more about kind of the details that we found in our search. And we've also included recommendations for caregivers, employment professionals, and youth with disabilities. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass it back to Sope.
Thank you once again, Lauren. I would like to welcome Sean McEwen, who is presenting on behalf of Community Futures Treaty 7. Sean is a workplace equity, diversity, inclusion, and culture consultant and a director at Real Eyes Capacity Consultants. He is also a blogger and public speaker specializing in workforce development and workplace culture. Sean supports employers, including those in private, nonprofit, and government, to build business sustainability, innovation, and profitability through diverse and inclusive workplaces with high levels of employee engagement. Sean will be presenting the Community Futures Treaty 7 position paper on intersectionality, disability, and Indigenous persons titled Intersectionality, Indigenous Experiences with Disability and Employment Support. So welcome, Sean. You can take things over now.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction. Yeah, so my friend Jonathan Redgun, who is the Disability Employment Coordinator at Treaty 7, isn't here today, but we've kind of, I would say, mentored each other over the last 16, 17 years or so, but a close collaborative relationship while I worked at different organizations and with different networks in the Treaty 7 region. My Blackfoot or Niitsitaatinen is Otsquatixi, which means bluebird. So that's part of my introduction. I am a settler of Scottish origins. I claim no Indigenous heredity or identity whatsoever. I'm just an ally and a collaborator with Community Futures Treaty 7. So Community Futures Treaty 7 is an economic development corporation in the Treaty 7 region. They do general labor market support, youth labor market support, as well as disability employment support. And within that disability employment program, they support 11 career centers throughout the Treaty 7 region. They do partnerships and employer collaborations, engagement and learning events, meaningful discussions. So these can be virtual events or conferences that Treaty 7 puts on a regular basis. They collaborate with government as well as the many First Nations within the Treaty 7 region and design and support employment innovation initiatives. So to get straight into our paper, we start with covering Indigenous peoples in Canada, just a profile in 2025. So Indigenous peoples is a term that applies to 3 distinct groups, including First Nations people, Inuit people, and Métis people. And that constitutes right now 5% of our population, so 2 million people, and growing fast. Indigenous people are the youngest and fastest growing group in Canada. There are over 630 First Nations communities in Canada with over 50 distinct languages and cultures. So when we think about Indigenous people, it's important for us to realize this is many groups of people with many different cultures and customs. Disability rates are pretty high with Indigenous folks, 33 to 50% compared to 22% across all age groups for non-Indigenous people. The research on this issue of disability is limited. So 33% is a stat from Stats Canada for off-reserve Indigenous people, but it is believed by Community Futures Treaty 7 that those rates are quite high in Indigenous communities. The on-reserve employment rate is only 47%, in comparison 74% for non-Indigenous people. So significantly lower levels of poverty, particularly among First Nations people on reserve. Let's talk about equity, because this is a big part of this paper, just looking at equity for Indigenous job seekers, for Indigenous employees, whatever the diversity group. It's critical for us to understand what is the experience associated with this. Equity generally considers a person's unique circumstances and makes adjustments so that the end result is equal. It's about identifying and dismantling barriers and ensuring that a person's identity isn't the primary predictor of opportunities or workplace outcomes. For Indigenous folks, the context for equity that we need to look at is just the Indigenous experience in Canada. And in order for us to understand that, we have to look at history. We have to look at settler colonialism. People might think that that's an historical event. The thing about settler colonialism is that it's not an historical event, it's a structure. So let's talk about that a little bit. Colonialism, plain and simple, is an act of political and economic domination involving control of lands and people by foreign settlers. And the goal of the colonizing country is to profit by exploiting the human and economic resources of the lands that they colonized. And settler colonialism is a structure. It's not an historical event. If you think about making a country the same as baking a cake, when you put all the ingredients in and bake that cake, it's pretty hard to extract any of the initial ingredients. So when some of those first ingredients were the very white supremacist views that went into that initial structure creation, it's hard to separate that out later. So it's really important in terms of equity for us to understand Indigenous people have a different experience with colonization than we do. As a perspective, settlers tend to celebrate colonization. We celebrate Canada Day. We celebrate everything that we know and love about Canada. It might be a different experience for Indigenous folks. That's an important equity consideration. As part of the structure, we do need to consider the Indian Act, which is still the primary or principal law governing Canada's relationship with Indigenous people. And the Indian Act was absolutely created to assimilate Indigenous people and any claim to land rights. The thing about colonizer culture, we love to write everything down. Our nation's ill will towards Indigenous peoples was disturbingly well documented, and consequently, it's very available to us. So some of the impacts of the Indian Act created the residential school system, made Indigenous ceremonies and cultural practices illegal, which really interrupts capacity building for folks. It imposed a European municipal government model, replacing all Indigenous self-governance, created a reserve system, which isolated and excluded people, restricted movement and access to resources. It restricted their ability to sell produce and livestock, and imposed a loss of status if Indigenous people attended university. It also denied and removed status from women and denied Indigenous people the right to seek legal advice. So all of these things had a pretty decimating impact on economic participation, on the perpetuation of culture, and on well-being in general. We want to look at intersectionality, we have to look at disability as well. So looking at the history of that, there's something that I think is important for us to understand called cultural persistence. And that means things that are elements of a culture that stay, that persevere through that culture. And there are elements of ableism that we still see structurally in Canada that started with things like the UK Poor Laws, which sent unemployed disabled people to workhouses, categorized people with disabilities as idle poor due to their unemployment and limited economic value. We can also look within Canada. Alberta and BC both implemented something called the Sexual Sterilization Act in 1928. And until 1973, Canada was kind of a world leader in eugenics. And within that, there were a lot of people with disabilities that were sterilized without their knowledge or consent, and a lot of Indigenous women that were sterilized without their knowledge or consent or under coercion. Our paper also talks about service provider collaborations. When we look at Indigenous intersectionality and their experience with employment in Canada, the experience of Indigenous job seekers with disabilities, there are some really interesting collaborations that have happened in Southern Alberta, and I can speak to them directly because I was directly involved in a lot of them. So with Community Futures Treaty 7, this is an organization that funds and provides resources to 11 separate career centers, some of them in urban settings, some of them on First Nations. Some of that collaboration between myself, the organizations that I worked with at the time, and Treaty 7 resulted in us helping them to develop funding proposals and projects, helping to expand their network and knowledge. When I originally met Jonathan, he was made Disability Employment Coordinator, but didn't know a lot about the supported employment model that we use in the sector. So that exchange of knowledge, inviting each other to conferences and symposiums, a lot of reciprocal learning. So while Jonathan learned a lot of things about supported employment, myself and my team learned a lot of things about Indigenous culture and barriers that people face. And in that process, really gave us an opportunity to be good treaty people and to honor the treaties. Some of the collaboration impacts for us as a service provider, our staff increased awareness of systemic and structural barriers, inclusion. We ended up hiring more Indigenous staff. We'd always had some Indigenous staff on our teams, but as we worked more with Indigenous people, hired more Indigenous staff and increased our capacity to serve Indigenous job seekers. So within the city of Calgary, we were able to get contracts through INEC to serve urban Indigenous people. And we even started a supported employment program in a regional Treaty 7 community called Tsuut'ina, and hired folks from Tsuut'ina to work alongside our staff in that program to transfer that knowledge. We all gained a better understanding of intersectionality. Our team members improved their capacity a lot, especially around equity, diversity, and inclusion competencies. Our work culture became stronger through new knowledge and perspectives. I can't emphasize that enough. When we talk about diversity, sometimes we pay more attention to the label of diversity than we do the reason behind it. And it is about new knowledge and new perspectives. And in the case of Indigenous people, it's often knowledge and perspectives that have been dismissed by colonizers. So this has been really helpful to us and strengthened us. It also resulted in us being viewed more favorably by funders. There is increasingly mention of Indigenous collaborations and connections in RFPs for funding proposals, and that was something we were already doing. The collaboration impacts for Community Futures Treaty 7, according to Jonathan and some of the folks that I know at Treaty 7, it increased their access to disability employment resources, including that supported employment model, sharing our networks with Community Futures and Treaty 7. They gained new allies and grew their own networks. They got assistance with fund development. They were included in some of my funding proposals and partnerships, and increased their own representation in service provider circles, like this one right here. There are some structural inequities that persist. There were structural inequities when I first met Jonathan and realized that I had about 10 times the resources within my one employment program than he had for the entire Treaty 7 region. So there are very limited Indigenous supported employment resources. We don't see that get funded a lot. The Alberta government does not fund any supported employment for people with intellectual disabilities in Treaty 7, even though Indigenous folks, especially in First Nations, have higher levels of disability. They also have poverty and travel barriers. So there are additional costs that come with this particular intersectionality that are not ever met. The Indigenous Career Centres, funded by the federal government through Community Futures Treaty 7, some of those career practitioners are carrying caseloads of up to 300 people. That's not a volume of clientele that you can effectively provide a supported employment model within, carrying 300 people on one caseload. Provincial and federal governments tend to engage in what I would call funding confusion, sometimes passing the buck. We also have things like the Labor Force Survey, which is done in every community in Canada by the federal government to make determinations about economic and employment development, workforce development needs within various regions. Every Indigenous community in Canada is exempt, so we don't get good information about what the needs of Indigenous communities are economically. These are just some of the structural inequities that persist. When it comes to serving Indigenous job seekers with disabilities, this is something that programs I've worked in have done a lot over the years. It does require awareness training in the context for equity. And that's training that I do as part of my consulting work for service provider organizations and networks around Canada. I think it's really surprising to people when they understand the history and some elements of the history that persist. It's also important for service providers to recognize disability is viewed very differently by Indigenous peoples. And in fact, Indigenous cultures, all of them that I'm aware of, have no word for disability. They might have words for specific impairments, but that whole catch-all label of disability isn't something that exists. And while settlers have kind of a medical model of disability and one that's based on deficits, that just doesn't happen within Indigenous cultures. People look at what gifts do people have, what do they bring to the table, what is their community role. So a very different identity. And people that we surveyed as part of our research, when we asked them if they identified as an Indigenous person or a person with a disability, everyone that responded said an Indigenous person. So interesting differences in views. It's also important for service providers to realize that settler culture can create some anxiety and confidence issues with Indigenous job seekers with disabilities. And this can be, and I've watched this happen, and I've seen it in some of the survey responses we got from service providers, misinterpreted as a lack of commitment or engagement. So you see people not attending appointments or pulling back from service, very often a result of anxiety and an expectation of failure. So more needs to be done in models that we attempt to provide to Indigenous folks. More needs to be done in the area of confidence building. Collaborations with Indigenous organizations is really important to help us understand that confidence building and the context for equity. And I think the presence of Indigenous team members is really important for Indigenous people to see themselves represented in our organizations and on our teams. If we look at employment equity in action, there's a number of things we can do. Just for starters, a really good understanding of equity and the context for equity for Indigenous people, recognizing and mitigating employment barriers, reciprocal learning, realizing that we have as much to learn from Indigenous people and maybe some things to unlearn as they have to learn from us. Recruitment, we can look at various different forms of outreach and different employment options, internships, mentorships, hiring groups at a time so people don't feel isolated. Embedding inclusive workplace foundations. So this can be policies, practices, work culture. What are we doing to create psychologically healthy and safe workplaces for Indigenous clientele and/or employees? Building relationships and trust. This is paramount when we look at the context for equity, the history of settler Indigenous relations in Canada. There is a huge need for us to rebuild relationships and trust. And the service provider community in Canada is uniquely positioned to do that. One of the ways we can begin with an Indigenous inclusion policy and some protocols, deferring to Indigenous voices and not trying to, go it alone on this stuff. Just like, in the disability community, people say nothing about us without us. Same deal for Indigenous folks. So a really good foundational document that can guide us as settlers and service providers is looking at some of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, specifically number 57 for government. We're funded by government, so there's a bit of an extension there, and 92 for corporate Canada, which any employer can use. So some of the things in those calls to action can allow us to address staff and leadership training, community partnerships and collaboration, recruitment and workplace inclusion, and the use of Indigenous educators and elders to help us learn their culture and protocols. So these are all elements that are explored on a much deeper level within the position paper. Realistically, the opportunities before the service provider community across Canada right now, connection and collaboration with Indigenous organizations and communities in order to work together, to improve our capacity to learn from each other. Valuable Indigenous perspectives. Again, I can't state enough how much stronger it made my team to have cultural collaborations and Indigenous people on our teams. Dismantling barriers together, identifying barriers that we as settlers might not be able to see very easily, but they are very real barriers for Indigenous people. Strengthening the sector in general. I think that Indigenous people have a deep sense of commitment to community. They have worldviews that are very based in relationality. Those are things that our sector can benefit from. And just solidarity. It's 2025. We've been working on this problem for a long time. I think that service providers have a unique opportunity as stewards of workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion to collaborate with Indigenous people and to develop solidarity within our country and to advance reconciliation, inclusion, and workforce development in Canada. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Sean. This wraps up our panel presentation on intersectionality, disability, and employment in Canada. We encourage you to visit the CASE website for copies of the position papers. On the website, you'll also find additional resources for service providers and employers, and you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter to stay up to date on the latest research and news around disability employment. Thank you.